Evening and welcome to the meeting of the Exam School Admissions Task Force. Because this is a remote session, I will ask Ms. Parvex to call the roll, please.
Thank you. Mr. Acevedo, Ms. Aguirre, sorry, Ms. Aguirre?
Yes.
Mr. Kreger?
Present.
Dr. Freeman Wisdom? Ms. Grassa?
Present.
Ms. Lum?
Present.
Ms. Nagasawa?
Present.
Ms. Garrett?
Present.
Ms. Tang?
Present.
Ms. Waite? Ms. Sullivan?
Present.
And Mr. Contampasses.
Present.
Thank you.
Thank you all. We are pleased to be offering live simultaneous interpretation this evening in Spanish, Haitian Creole, Cape Verdean, Portuguese, Cantonese, Mandarin, Vietnamese, Somali, Arabic, and American Sign Language. After I finish introducing the interpreters, we will activate the interpretation icon, the globe, at the bottom of your screen. Click the icon to select your language preference. Beginning with our Spanish interpreter is Randolph Dominguez. Will you please invite our Spanish-speaking audience to switch their Zoom channel in Spanish?
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Randolph Dominguez. I'm going to be your Spanish interpreter for today. Muy buenas noches, damas y caballeros. Mi nombre es Randolph Domínguez. Voy a ser su intérprete del idioma español el día de hoy de manera simultánea. Para poder escuchar esta reunión en su idioma español, deben de ir a la parte inferior de la pantalla y buscar un globo. Una vez ustedes vean este globo, van a seleccionar el idioma español y ahí van a poder escuchar la reunión de manera simultánea. Si están utilizando un celular, deben de buscar los 3 puntos en la parte superior derecha y ahí deben de seleccionar el idioma español. Si no tienen la actualización más reciente de Zoom, deben de bajarla yendo a www.zoom.com/update. Muchas gracias.
Thank you. Ms. Parvex, I understand that Dr. Karlenberg may be having difficulty logging on. Could you possibly assist him?
Yes, I will send him an email right now.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Our Cape Verdean interpreter is Lidiana Mendez. Will you please give the Zoom instructions in Cape Verdean, please?
Yes. Hi, good afternoon. My name is Lidiana and I'll be your Cape Verdean Creole interpreter. Alô, sim, boa tarde. Eu sou o intérprete de Cabo Verde Crioulo simultânea. E se você criou a reunião esta tarde, você vai na botelha, você clica na idioma de preferência que é Cabo Verde Crioulo e depois você ouve a interpretação lá. Obrigada.
Thank you. Our Portuguese interpreter is Christiane Leitner. Will you please give the Zoom instructions in Portuguese?
Olá, boa noite. Meu nome é Cristiane, eu sou intérprete de português brasileiro. Se vocês precisarem de ajuda para entender essa reunião, vão até a parte de baixo da tela, onde tem um globinho, e selecione o canal português. Aí você vai poder ouvir a reunião traduzida simultaneamente. Obrigada.
Thank you. Our Vietnamese interpreter is Duyen True. Will you please give Zoom instructions in Vietnamese?
Yeah, good afternoon. I'm a Vietnamese interpreter for the meeting tonight. Xin chào quý anh chị, tôi là thông dịch người Việt tối hôm nay. Nếu mà anh chị cần thông dịch thì hãy xin bấm vào quả cầu và chọn ngôn ngữ tiếng Việt. Tôi sẽ cung cấp thông dịch viên liên tục cho các anh chị. Thank you.
Thank you. Our Mandarin interpreter is Terry Yin. Please give the instructions in Mandarin.
Hi, thank you. This is Terry. I'll be your Mandarin interpreter. 大家好，我的名字叫 Terry， 我会是你们的国语翻译。待会呢，你们在这个屏幕下方就会看到有一个地球仪的图标，然后你们点一下地球仪的图标，选择 Mandarin， 就是国语，你就可以听到国语的翻译了。如果呢你是用手机或者 iPad 上网的话呢，你可以点一下3个点，然后就可以选择翻译功能，然后也可以选择到这个Mandarin， 也就是国语的翻译。好，谢谢大家 ，Thank you。
Thank you. Our Cantonese interpreter is Anna Tse. Will you please give Zoom instructions in Cantonese?
Sure, thank you. Hi everyone, I'm Anna. I'll be your Cantonese interpreter for the meeting today. 大家好，我 Anna，我係嚟今晚嘅廣東話同步翻譯。如果你見到熒光屏下面有個地球儀，咁佢撳呢個地球儀揀 Chinese，咁就係廣東話啦。今日咁如果你用呢個手機嘅話咧，咁你就撳嗰3個點，咁咧就會寫到更多，咁你就可以揀 Chinese 就係廣東話同步翻譯噶啦。多謝大家，一陣間見啦，拜拜。Thank you, all set.
Thank you, Anna. Our Haitian Creole interpreter is Sergio Saint Hilaire.
Hi, everyone. Good evening.
Good evening.
My name is Sergio Saint-Hilaire, Haitian Creole interpreter. Bonjour, c'est avec plaisir que ma peut prendre un après-midi. C'est moi-même qui peux interpréter pour nous, tout le monde qui parle créole. Et moi, demandez-nous si nous besoin d'entrer dans la conversation, nous cliquons sur le globe là et nous besoin dans le channel français. Et que tout ça nous a besoin de dire, pas hésiter pour nous dire. Si nous besoin d'entrer en contact, nous avons des questions pour nous poser, pas hésiter pour nous dire. C'est à plaisir que m'a fait ça. Moi, souhaitez-nous pour nous qu'il y ait une bonne écoute. Merci.
Thank you. Our Arabic interpreter is Gada Siddiq. Please give the instructions in Arabic.
Hi, this is Gada Siddiq, the Arabic interpreter. مرحبا بكم. أنا مترجمتكم للغة العربية في اجتماعنا اليوم بشأن عملية القبول بمدارس الاختبار الخاصة اليوم الثلاثاء. باستطاعتكم الدخول على رابط الندوة عبر الإنترنت على تطبيق زوم، يا إما على التليفون أو بنقرأ على اللينك. شكرا لكم.
Thank you. Our Somali interpreter is Camilla Fartun Jamal. Please give the
Hi.
instructions.
Good afternoon. How are you doing? My name is Camila Fartun. I'm going to be your interpreter today. magacaygu waa Camila Fartun. maanta waxaan yahay tarjumihiina. waxaan ka hadlaynaa shirkii 33 dhacay wixii kasoo baxay guddiga imtixaanaadka iskuulka iyo Boston iyo qaadista diiwaangelinta shaqaalaha shirka. marka waxaad iga heli kartaan qolka oo Soomaaliga. marka waa mahadsantihiin. Thank you.
Thank you. We also have American Sign Language interpreters, Erin Foley and Andrew Pidcomany. Thank you. Please say hello and introduce yourself. Thank you for all assisting us this evening. We will now activate the interpretation icon at the bottom of your screen. I'd like to remind everyone to speak at a slower pace so as to assist our interpreters. We'll move on now to the approval of the minutes from the March 23rd, 2021 meeting. At this time, I would like to entertain a motion to approve the minutes as presented. Chair will entertain a motion.
I so move.
Thank you, Mr. Krager. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you. Is there any discussion or objection to the motion? Any additions or deletions? Seeing none, Ms. Parvex, will you please call the roll?
Thank you. Mr. Acevedo? Ms. Aguirre?
Yay.
Mr. Krager?
Aye.
Dr. Freeman Wisdom? Ms. Grassa?
Aye.
Ms. Lam?
Aye.
Ms. Nagasawa?
Aye.
Ms. Garrett?
Aye.
Ms. Tang?
Aye.
Ms. Waite?
Aye.
Ms. Sullivan?
Yes.
Mr. Contempasis?
Yes,
Thank you.
the motion carries. At this time, I would like to welcome our two guest speakers this evening, both of whom are tremendous advocates for change in admissions. They have both worked tirelessly to ensure that all students, wherever they may be, have access to quality and equity in terms of admission policies and decisions. I would ask Mr. Krager to introduce our two guests, but before I do that, I'd like to ask whether our co-chair, Ms. Sullivan, has something to add.
No, I do not. Thank you, Mr. Contapasis.
Thank you, Ms. Sullivan. Mr. Krager, if you would, please.
It would be an honor, Mr. Contapasis. So as when we gathered as an advisory group last summer, our hope was to leave no stone unturned in understanding the models that other cities have advanced to support equal educational opportunities in selective admission schools. As a group, as a task force, we've heard from Sean Corcoran of Vanderbilt University to lay out a number of the factors that he's looked at, and we could not be in better hands than those of Richard Kallenberg and Michelle Burris to help us really understand how these models have played out in Chicago, are playing out in Charlotte, in New York City, and across the country. Richard Kallenberg is the director of K-12 Equity and the senior fellow at the Century Foundation. He is the author or editor of 17 books and has been called the intellectual father of the economic integration movement in K-12 schooling. I've had the pleasure of reading a number of those, starting with All Together Now, and I'm quite confident that his experiences in guiding Chicago and Charlotte and other cities in addressing the notions of socioeconomic school integration will have a profound impact on our understanding of what we can apply for our city of Boston. Similarly, Michelle Burris is Senior Policy Associate at the Century Foundation, and she focuses on the racial and socioeconomic integration in pre-K-12 settings. Prior to joining the Century Foundation, Michelle was a teacher at Truman High School in New York City, working with African immigrant students. We've met Michelle from her work with students, parents, and alumni of Hunter College High School in New York, and her efforts to support their conversations with students and parents and educators from across the country on these issues, including here in Boston. It is a great pleasure to have you both here to help us understand the models at play in other parts of the country, their impact on racial, socioeconomic, and neighborhood diversity in selective admission schools, and what the lessons that you've learned from these experiences that could guide and inform our work here in Boston. We're grateful to have you here.
If I may, before you begin, I've been asked by our interpreters to once again slow down the pace so they can move their particular constituents into the discussion.
My apologies.
I don't know which of you will start. Richard, Michelle, it's all yours. Michelle, you're starting. Go to it, please.
Thank you so much, Mike, and good evening, everyone. It is a pleasure to be here with you and a pleasure to be joining. I will now ask Lena to please share the slides, and I will briefly speak with you about a youth summit the Century Foundation recently hosted with Hunter College High School in New York City. On February 25th, the Century Foundation co-hosted a youth summit with Hunter College High School. The original vision was to have 25 students and youth activists who wanted to push forward on activism and integration. On February 25th, we had 86 attendees of youth activists from across the country, including students in Boston, New York City, Chicago, San Francisco, and in Washington, DC. We were also honored to have your co-chair and NAACP chapter president, Ms. Tanisha Sullivan, provide extraordinary remarks on the importance of race-conscious policies in education. Next slide, please. We were very fortunate to have representation from Boston, particularly as a junior at the John O'Brien Exam School. This particular student, Nesaj, presented on the demographics in Boston and how the pandemic has impacted the admission structure. Next slide, please. NASAJ particularly presented on the demographics in Boston, particularly the low Black and Latinx student enrollment in the school in comparison to the overall percentage of students in the city of Boston, and also the low percentage of economically disadvantaged students. Next slide, please. Ultimately, the purpose of our youth summit was to learn about what other schools are doing across the country to reform their admission structures, particularly the role of youth and how we can form a coalition with the Biden administration. Next slide, please. Hunter College High School in New York similarly presented on the demographics, particularly the percentage of test takers and those who are admitted to Hunter College High School in comparison to the overall demographics of students in New York City. Similarly, and to no surprise, students of color were widely underrepresented at Hunter College High School in New York City. Next slide, please. We also had representation from Thomas Jefferson High School in Richmond, Virginia, which is one of the governor's schools. The student representatives, particularly the Thomas Jefferson Alumni Action Group, presented on the demographics of students, where they found that Black and Latinx students are widely underrepresented, as well as economically disadvantaged students. They compared the demographics in the class of 2015 to the demographics in the class of 2024. However, recently, the Fairfax County School Board in December of last year adopted a holistic review process for their admissions to ensure a more diverse pool in the students who are admitted. This included the cancellation of the admissions test and also the cancellation of the application fee. Thomas Jefferson will also consider more socioeconomic factors, including students with disabilities, multilingual learners, economically disadvantaged students, and students who attend middle schools where Thomas Jefferson has widely underrepresented students. The Thomas Jefferson Alumni Action Group looks forward to seeing which diverse pool will be more, if the pool will be more diverse and made up of students of more racial and socioeconomic backgrounds. The Thomas Jefferson Alumni Action Group has also engaged with the media. We were very fortunate to have representation from the Washington Post and Education Utopia, a national media organization, in attendance at our youth summit, and we were able to speak with them about our efforts. Next slide, please. In regards to key lessons and takeaway, the Youth Summit reinforced that student voices matter at the grassroots, state, and federal levels. In order to champion efforts for integration activism, particularly among youth, the students of color at Hunter College High School experienced racial microaggressions, and racial hostility. My apologies, I will slow down. Some students were called the N-word, and they experienced a lack of support among students and administrators. The students at Hunter College High School, particularly the students of color, recommended that the school administer school climate surveys in order to make the pool more diverse. We also met with members of the Biden administration and former members of the Obama administration. We particularly met with Ms. Anarima Burgeva, who worked at the United States Department of Justice in the Civil Rights Division. The students met with her in regards to how to file an Office of Civil Rights complaint and how to engage with the media. Much of the feedback that came from the integration and the Youth Activist Summit was that we do not want to work in silos. Many attendees were in relief that we are not working in silos and that many people care about this work. We had students speak about the racial hostilities that they experienced at school. We also had a student in California speak about the death threats that she received, a minority student at Lowell High School in San Francisco. She was very vulnerable and spoke about her experience and how we must form coalitions. Last, researchers are paying attention to student activists. On March 10th, the same student from O'Brien was able to present to the Learning Policy Institute on diverse admissions at magnet schools. The Learning Policy Institute is presided by Dr. Linda Darling-Hammond, who was also the president of the Transition Committee for President Biden's education team. Our next steps are to continue forming coalitions with the Biden administration and to ultimately ensure that our schools are more diverse racially and socioeconomically, and that they reflect the diversity of the communities that we serve in. I would like to thank all of you for your valuable time and participation, and I will now pass it to my colleague, Rick, who will present more on his experiences in Chicago.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much, Michelle. I had some friends at Hunter College High School who asked me to, if the Century Foundation wanted to get involved in a youth summit. And I said, I know exactly who can pull this off brilliantly, Michelle Burris, and she did. And it was wonderful to see students from across the country grappling with the very same issues that you're dealing with, and trying to forge a better path for students. So I also have some slides, and Lena, I don't know if you've got them or whether I should share my screen.
I got them. I can share them if you would like to.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that. So anyway, let me first begin by commending all of you for taking on this issue. It's an issue that the lack of diversity is something that has been sustained in many cases for decades at selective high schools. And the fact that you all are grabbing this issue by the horns is so heartening, as is the action of students and administrators throughout the country. So my wife is from New York, and she always complains that I speak too slowly. So maybe this will be the one time when it will work in my favor. But if I speak too quickly or too slowly, just someone can let me know if the pace is right. So I want to talk for a couple minutes about some work that I did in Chicago a little more than a decade ago to try to diversify their selective schools, and some more recent work that I did in Charlotte as well. So in Chicago, the school system was under a court desegregation order, which involved explicit racial quotas for different high schools. When Chicago moved to be declared unitary, that is, they no longer needed to take steps to desegregate, they wanted to preserve the benefits of diversity, of racial and economic diversity in the Chicago selective schools. And so they asked me to help them devise a system that would be legal and also ensure that the schools were diverse and of high quality. So the Chicago officials I worked with really had two goals that I completely agreed with. One is that we wanted to provide all students with the benefits of a diverse learning environment. And given some evidence from other school districts and their selective schools, Chicago was rightly concerned that when they were moving from desegregation to unitary status, they could end up losing the benefits of that diversity. And so that was an important goal that I know you all share, that everyone learns from and better in a diverse environment. And the second goal, given that this was a selective set of public schools, was to do a better job of identifying talent than simply looking at traditional academic metrics. That Chicago wanted to recognize the obstacles that a student had to overcome in order to achieve her academic record. We shouldn't just look at the finishing point of their academic record, but rather what distance they had to travel. If we could go to the next slide, please. So in terms of achieving the benefits of diversity, you all are I'm sure, deeply familiar with the research suggesting that diversity makes us smarter, that there are richer discussions when students bring different life experiences to the classroom, something that's been recognized in higher education and increasingly at the K through 12 level. In explaining the rationale to the public for our system of considering socioeconomic status, we talked a fair amount about the ways in which a student is unprepared for the 21st century workforce if he or she is not in a diverse high school environment where one can learn how to get along with people of all different backgrounds, work with them, and learn from them. There's one study that found that the number one reason that people are fired in the employment setting is not that they're incompetent. It's that they can't get along with other people. And often that has to do with an inability to get along with people of different ethnic, racial, or economic backgrounds. And so that was, this is backed up by lots of research, but it was also an important message for the broader Chicago community to hear. Next slide, please. In Chicago, we used socioeconomic rather than racial metrics in the admissions process because the Supreme Court had laid down some restrictions on the ability to use race in the Parents Involved versus Seattle 2007 decision, with which I'm sure you're deeply familiar. In addition, there are some political constraints to using race explicitly in admissions, and Chicago officials recognized there would be broader public support for using socioeconomic status as a factor. But at the same time, Chicago deeply valued racial diversity, as do all of us, and wanted to recognize that certain socioeconomic factors are particularly strongly correlated with race. And so I'm giving one example here, that there is a connection between family income and race. There is a stronger connection between neighborhood levels of poverty and race. So one of the deeply troubling facts about American society is that Black and Latino families who are middle class, making more than $75,000 a year, upper middle class, live in areas with higher concentrations of poverty on average than white families making less than $40,000 a year. Next slide. And if I can pause for a second, I'm speaking very slowly, so should I go faster or slower? What's, I don't know if I could get some feedback on that.
Richard, this is Mike. You're doing well.
Okay, I'll keep it at this pace then. So in Chicago, the academic criteria that have been considered for many years include three parts and equally weighted. This performance on state test scores, the grades that a student achieves in school, and then performance on a special admissions exam. Now, as I understand it, Boston has, you all have in your new experiment are admitting some students strictly by the academic criteria and others with a consideration of socioeconomic status. And that's the same path that Chicago chose to pursue. So 30% of students are admitted on the strict academic criteria. And then 70% of students are admitted within their socioeconomic tier. So Chicago divides itself into 4 socioeconomic tiers by census tract. And I'll show you a map in a minute. And the idea was that the 70% of seats would be allocated equally between the 4 socioeconomic tiers. So in essence, 17.5% of seats to each of 4 socioeconomic tiers. Now, how did we create the tiers? Well, going back to that guiding principle that we were looking for the benefits of diversity and to identify talent, including obstacles that a student had to overcome, we selected 6 criteria, socioeconomic criteria in the census tract. They're available in the census tract data. Parental income, parental education, home ownership rates, the proportion of single parent households, proportion non-English speaking, and high school performance. I'm sorry, homeschool performance, the school that where they would have been assigned, whether or not they attended that school. So this is meant to, each of these factors has behind it academic research suggesting that if one faces an obstacle in this arena, let's say low parental income, then it's especially impressive if the student achieves fairly well on academic criteria, given that we know on average it's an obstacle. So that was the logic behind those criteria. Next slide, please. This gives you a visual sense of how this works in Chicago. The green census tracts are the wealthiest of the 4. They're tier 4 in the Chicago nomenclature, and the red are the lowest income or the most disadvantaged areas, tier 1. And then you have tier 2 and 3 in the middle. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk about Chicago results in a minute, but before I do that, I want to suggest that,
Sorry, I just,
yes,
we have the Portuguese interpreter. Can you please mute yourself or go back to the correct channel because you're speaking over the presenter? Thank you.
okay. So I was just saying that before I talk about the results in Chicago, let me mention that the Chicago plan is one that is can be adapted to different circumstances. And one example of that is in Charlotte, Mecklenburg, North Carolina. Charlotte has a number of magnet schools. It's not quite analogous to your situation with the Boston exam schools because these are non-selective magnet schools. But the same principle applies that there are benefits to socioeconomic diversity and racial diversity. And so Charlotte, rather than using 4 tiers, uses three socioeconomic tiers, low, medium, and high. There was a recognition in Charlotte that, or a belief, which is backed up by research, that parental education is a particularly important factor. And so, whereas Chicago weighted all 6 factors equally, Charlotte weights parental education more heavily than the other factors. Third, Charlotte supplements the use of census data with individual family data. One downside to using census data is that you can have outliers. So a wealthy family that lives in a higher poverty neighborhood. And Charlotte wanted to recognize that by instituting a system that asked parents to report their education level and parental income within bands, not their precise income, but within ranges. And so that's a supplement to the census data. Next slide, please. So here are some results. And this is from a report that the Brookings Institution did in 2019. It may be a little bit difficult to read, but they were looking at exam schools throughout the country and seeing how close the racial and economic representation was to the general population. And you can see that there are gaps in certain communities, and including Boston, but that in Chicago, for the most part, those gaps are smaller. So white representation, Black representation, Asian representation is fairly close at there are 11 exam schools in Chicago, compared with the general public school population. The one area where Chicago doesn't do quite as well in terms of representation is the Hispanic representation, where there remains a gap. Next slide, please. Then there's the question of economic representation. And again, you can see that there are gaps where low-income students are underrepresented at the selective high schools in most cities. In Chicago, the gap is smaller than in other cities. And you can see in Boston, it's a fairly large gap. Next slide, please. Because Chicago has 11 selective enrollment schools, and Boston only has 3. I thought I'd also share the data for one particular school, Whitney Young High School, which is considered among the very strongest, academically strongest in Chicago. At Whitney Young, you have a beautiful array of racial, ethnic, and economic diversity. But I wanted to highlight Whitney Young because my rough sense is that it is comparable to your, Boston's most selective high schools in terms of academic reputation. Whereas I want to acknowledge that some of the 11 in Chicago may not be considered as strong. They're all excellent schools, but here's an example that is, I think, particularly relevant to Boston. Next slide, please. Okay, and this is just information about how to contact me, and I know we'll have a little time for discussion now, but if there's a question that occurs to you later, that's my email address, and I'm glad to respond to questions that come up later. Thank you.
Okay.
Well, thank you, Ms. Burris and Mr. Collenberg. We greatly appreciate your presentations. We are going to open it up for questions, any questions that members of the task force may have. Yes, Ms. Lum. You're on mute.
It's not a Zoom meeting unless someone starts speaking when they're on mute. I was wondering if the Whitney Young enrollment statistics, if that's the current enrollment?
So it's fairly recent. I think they're from 2019.
And is there historic data to show that the changes that have been made to the admissions process has impacted that distribution?
Yes. So Whitney Young had, during desegregation, it had the racial breakdown that was written into the agreement, the consent decree, and then Whitney Young, when it transitioned to socioeconomic status, had representation that was not identical in terms of race, but where there'd been a strong ethnic and racial mix at the school, and that's been consistent, going back several years. If anything, I would say the numbers were a little bit stronger in some of the earlier years, but they remain, quite diverse today.
Thank you. Ms. Aguirre?
Yes, a question. You were saying at some point that there was, I think, 6 social parameters that were evaluated, and at the beginning they're all weighted equally, and that was a suggestion of having parental education getting more weight than the others. Could you elaborate a little bit on that?
Sure. So let me distinguish between Chicago and Charlotte. Chicago still equally weights those 6 factors. But when Charlotte was seeking to borrow and learn from Chicago, they put their own twist on the program and increased the weight for education. So it's two different systems. For me, one takeaway is that I think the Chicago system has worked fairly well in the sense of producing racially, economically, and ethnically diverse schools with high academic standards. Political acceptance has been stable. There hasn't been a big movement to eliminate the system. And at the same time, it's not written in stone, and individual school districts can make adaptations that can improve the system. And so that's my main reason for mentioning that distinction between the way the two cities handle socioeconomic diversity.
Thank you. Are there any additional questions at this time? No? Yes, Mr. Prager.
Mr. Kallenberg, could you walk us a little deeper through the choice to take individual families' income and levels of educational attainment into consideration in Charlotte? Was there pushback on that? Was there concern on that? Do you feel like it more closely aligns to the values that Charlotte was seeking to achieve? Just if you could elaborate on it a little more so we could understand how it fits with a model that otherwise tries to focus on broader categories.
I think there are trade-offs involved in these two systems, and I think there are advantages and disadvantages to both. The advantage to considering individual level information about families is that if we're trying to identify talent, obstacles overcome, then the research literature would suggest neighborhood matters, but family matters as well. So in an ideal world, I think one would always want both sets of factors to come into play. Chicago resisted using individual family data in part because they were concerned about reliability. As you well know, people are very motivated to have their children attend these selective schools. And so there was a concern that there would be cheating, in essence, and there would be challenges involved in verifying information. Charlotte made the judgment that they would try to put some guardrails in place to try to address that challenge. So if you have, for example, a family living in a very wealthy census tract, claiming that the parents only have a high school education and are below the poverty line, there might be a red flag set off and some investigation to make sure. So I think those are the competing factors. I think everyone would say, in an ideal world, it's better to have family and neighborhood level data. But there are questions of administrability that come into play.
Thank you. Yes, Mr. Contemplasis.
Richard, you mentioned that there are roughly 10 or 11 schools in Chicago. That, I assume then that Chicago has some sort of school choice plan where students from the entire city are able to put their choices in some sort of order. Is there any limit to the number of schools that a student can apply to? And, you know, we've heard that there may be additional factors on the students. Are these 11 schools distributed evenly throughout the district or throughout the city? And if a student applies to 11 of them, first of all, is that allowed? Secondly, has anyone done anything around the impact on students of having to deal with all of the stressful factors that we often hear students are going through in order to get into, you know, one of the 3 exam schools in Boston?
So those are great questions for which I don't think I have very satisfying answers. I know that they clearly can apply to more than one school because oftentimes there are reputational factors at play, and some schools are considered stronger than others, and so students will apply to more than one. I don't know if there are a limit on the number. In terms of researching this, the stress involved, I don't know of anything that's been done. I mean, I know a number of school districts have tried to simplify processes by having a, one portal through which students can apply to multiple schools, which makes eminent sense to me. But I was really brought in for the kind of the research on socioeconomic status, and so I'm sorry I don't have more information on some of that. But I do have someone I can connect you with who would know the answers to all your questions.
If I may, with a follow-up, and this again may not be something that you may be able to answer, but we in Boston at the exam school level have been criticized in a sense that the district has not done as good a job as possible in identifying these opportunities that may be available. Has there been any emphasis in Chicago that you may be aware of that really makes certain that families that may not know how to, for lack of a better term, get into the process are encouraged by the district to really become aware of these opportunities?
I don't know whether Chicago has that type of a plan in place. I know that I'm doing some work with Hunter College High School in New York City, and that's a big part of their effort to communicate with parents. Once it's known that the student is academically talented, they want to make sure that people are aware of the opportunity to attend Hunter College High School, and any college seeking to diversify knows it needs to take those steps as well.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Nagasawa, did you have a question?
Yes. Do you know how the census tract data and the individual reported data is combined or weighted, I guess? Like is the census data weighted more heavily than the individual family data is, or are there certain times when individual family data is weighted more heavily?
So in Charlotte, they use both, and my recollection was that it was an equal weight. That's my recollection. But again, I think the key is to consider, the opportunities here of considering different factors, and then not be locked into what other communities are doing. I also think there's an opportunity to run simulations to find out what would happen if we weighted family level data, less heavily than census data. How would that affect diversity, broadly speaking? I mean, the Supreme Court has made clear that it's fine to have diversity as a goal. You wouldn't want to be in a position where you reverse engineer a specific racial result that could get you into legal trouble. But I think it's reasonable to try different options and see how they work out. In terms of the academic research, I think that you'd have a strong case for weighting the family data and the census data, neighborhood data equally, if you felt like the data were reliable.
Thank you. Are there any further questions from task force members? I see none. I want to again thank Mr. Collenberg and Ms. Burris for being with us today. Ms. Burris, thank you so very much for keeping Boston in mind as you shared with us tonight. Many of us greatly appreciated the opportunity to share our work here in the city and to also learn from students from across the country what they're doing as it relates to selective school admissions. And so thank you so much for extending that invitation to us previously, but thank you both very much for being with us tonight. Your contribution will certainly help to inform the work that lies ahead for us. So thank you.
Thank you.
So we are going to Ms. Parvex transition into public comment.
Thank you very much. We have 12 speakers this evening, and each speaker will have 2 minutes per person. I will let you know when you have 20 seconds left. Those who require language interpretation services will receive an additional 2 minutes. Please state your name, affiliation, and what neighborhood you are from before you begin. When I call your name, please raise your hand virtually in Zoom. Also, please make sure you're signed into Zoom with the same name you used to sign up for public comment. That will allow us to identify you when it's your turn to testify. Our first speaker this evening is Dara Murphy, followed by Julie Canfield and Edith Bazil. Please raise your hands. Dara Murphy. I don't see Dara Murphy. Julie Canfield.
Please let me know if you can hear me.
We can hear you, thank you.
Oh, thank you. Hello, my name is Julie Canfield. I live in Roslindale. I'm the parent of a child at BLS and professionally have been a clinical social worker in community-based mental health services for over 30 years. It seems the one question that has been brought up for debate and that still hasn't been answered is whether the city wants the exam schools or not. And if that answer continues to be yes, then we need to come up with measures that make that exam equitable and fair to all students living in the city. We have many at-risk schools that are considered underperforming and some even at risk for the state to take them over because of the risk level being so high. These are known as level 3, 4, and 5 at-risk underperforming schools. The city should be pouring resources into all of the public schools, especially in the early grades of elementary school, in order to prepare the students for academic success and entrance into exam schools if they chose to apply. The MAP test that was proposed for the exam school admission is unbiased and should remain an untimed test so that all students approach the test in the same manner that does away with the inequities of some students taking the test timed and some taking it untimed throughout the city. Secondly, students should be allowed to take the MAP test on more than one occasion, just as is done for the SAT exam for college entrance. The opportunity to take the test more than once gives families the opportunity to reassess their children's strengths and areas of academic challenge so they can seek out support, tutoring, and interventions if necessary. Other solutions could include having an 80-20 split with 80% of the seats allocated by pure merit with 50% from the unbiased untimed MAP test, plus 50% English and math grades in the 5th and 6th grades. The other 20% of seats. The other 20% of seats could be allocated either by a holistic assessment that includes teacher recommendations, essays, and socioeconomic circumstances, or by the highest GPAs from the underperforming schools to try to capture a wider diversity of high-achieving students that may not have had access to the quality academic preparation over the previous 6 years of their elementary school. Thank you.
Ms. Parvex, before we move on to the next speaker, I think that was Ms. Canfield who just spoke?
Yes.
Ms. Canfield, I don't know if you've done so already, but if you haven't, could you please send your recommendations to the task force so that we have those in writing? So we can just make sure that we don't miss them.
Yes, of course. Thank you.
Thank you. Very helpful.
Thank you. Next speaker is Edith Bazil.
Good evening and thank you. Paraphrasing H.L. Mencken, quote, "For every complex problem, there is a simple answer and it is wrong," end of quote. White supremacy is the complex problem. The answer is in the history. The history of anti-Black policies in BPS that goes back to enslavement and was rerouted in desegregation during the 1970s. That resulted in white flight. For white students who remained in Boston, AWC was designed. AWC is really code for all white classes and a feeder for the exam schools, most especially Boston Latin School. Admissions continues to use false and rigged systems of meritocracy, anti-Black gatekeeping policies, as well as social, cultural, political, and economic systems that work against Black students. Toni Morrison said, quote, the very serious function of racism is distraction. It keeps you from doing your work," end of quote. My point is, you cannot fix a system rooted in anti-Blackness that rejects the academic gifts and talents of Black students. Former BPS Superintendent Dr. Tommy Chang recognized this. He had the courage to expose, challenge, disrupt, and dismantle parts of the system. He was giving a one-way ticket for his solution. Why? Because he refused to bow down to the political pressure and uphold a system that made white people comfortable because it appealed to their white privilege while denying Black children the education to which they are entitled, and at the same time blamed students and castigated Black students as unworthy. If BPS is serious about change, it will examine BPS Superintendent Dr. Chang's model because it can be applied to the exam schools. Black citizens should not have to pay taxes that are used to discriminate against their own children. Lastly, in the words of James Baldwin, quote, "You always told me it takes time. You've taken my father's time, my mother's time, my uncle's time, my brother and sister's time, my nieces and nephews' time. How much time do you need for your progress?" Thank you very much.
Thank you. Next speaker is Harneen Chernal, followed by Yufang Rong and Alan Tian. Please raise your hand. Harneen Chernal. And please, speakers, could you please speak a little bit slower for the interpreters?
Sure. Good evening. My name is Harneen Chernow. I'm a white parent living in Jamaica Plain with 2 kids who have attended BPS since kindergarten and am currently enrolled at BLA. I'm speaking today in favor of this committee's work to change the criteria for admission to the exam schools. What you are doing is hard and complicated, but it is absolutely necessary. If we as a community have any chance of building an equitable school system, we need an admissions policy that helps to level the playing field for those who have historically been at a disadvantage. The status quo is not an option. Like many parents, I assume my kids would strive for a seat at BLS because that was presented to us as, quote, the best BPS had to offer. After visiting BLS, however, we weren't so sure. Yes, the school has an embarrassment of riches, but both of my kids ultimately chose not to pursue BLS because, as they said, it did not feel like a Boston public school. They both noted the lack of diversity, which as BPS students was not what they were used to. We happily chose BLA and have benefited from an incredible, diverse learning environment. Yet even having that option to make that choice shows how much my family has benefited from an admissions process that has disproportionately rewarded applicants from certain neighborhoods and backgrounds. And while as a parent activist, I have worked for a more equitable school assignment system at the entry kindergarten level, I recognize that my own privilege has limited my sense of what is possible in terms of a redo of exam schools and the admissions model. The work of this committee is challenging all of us to expand our vision of what's right, and it is long overdue. We live in a time where public education is viewed as a private good, where instead of pushing for a system that distributes funding and resources in a way that benefits all students, we have our own race to the top going on, with parents in the know working to get the best for their own kids, usually at the expense of others who come to the table with much less. The exam school admissions policy reflects that mindset. Families with resources and knowledge about how it all works access or purchase additional supports to prepare their child for the exam. Research shows that entrance exams, MCAS, standardized tests, all of them are aligned with one's socioeconomic status. On the whole, the wealthier you are, the better you will do. I support your efforts to create a policy that allows kids from all neighborhoods and backgrounds to have a more equal access to seats at these schools. I thank you for your leadership in seeking to right this long-term wrong.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is Yufang Rong. Yufang, please unmute yourself.
Hello, can you hear me now?
We can hear you, thank you.
Oh, great, thank you. So my name is Yufang Rong. I live in West Roxbury and I'm a BLS parent. First, I would like to thank all task force members for your time and hard work devoted to improving the exam admission policy. So Ms. Sullivan mentioned several times that you will look at data. Data show that 2 of Boston exam schools are quite diversified, but Boston Latin School lacks diversity. Several years ago, Harvard Kennedy School did a thorough study for Boston exam schools. Based on data, they identified that purely using MCAS scores without using GPA can increase Boston Latin schools' Black and Latino students by 50%. I understand that private schools may not take MCAS. So last year, Superintendent Casillas and her team identified NWEA to provide MAP tests for exam school admission. MAP test is similar to MCAS in many ways. So I suggest that you listen to experts, make the MAP test accessible to all the students, provide more guidance and tutoring to the economically disadvantaged kids, and then use their test scores to get them accepted to the exam schools. Most importantly, the Harvard study pointed out, quote, to make even greater progress likely requires substantial efforts by BPS to close racial achievement gaps that appear prior to exam school applications, end quote. So I hope when you look at Boston exam schools, you can see and tackle the root problem. It is a pipeline that needs to be fixed. It's not a secret that most of Boston public schools are on the bottom. Sure, thank you. So, okay, I will skip to the last point.
I'm actually going to ask, could you, don't skip to the last point, if you could, because I really want to hear the rest of what you have to say. So could you just be mindful of the time?
Oh, thank you so much. So actually, it's almost the last point. I just want to say that it's not a secret that most of Boston public schools are on the bottom of all the schools in the country. So if balancing the risk at exam schools is someone's sole goal, the community may be further divided. We should avoid that. So one of the great points in Mr. Kallenberg's presentation is that Chicago has 11 selective high schools, but Boston only has 3. So actually last year at the very beginning, I sent an email to superintendent of the people comments. I said, why don't we add more selective schools to accommodate more students if more kids can handle the rigorous curriculum? So that's all. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next speaker is Alan Tian, followed by Eric Shi and Lei Chi. I can't see Alan Tian. So Eric Shi.
Can you hear me now?
We can hear you. Thank you.
Hi, thank you, everyone. So my name is Eric Xi. So I was driving, I have to forward, so I'm not prepared for this talk, but I just want to say 2 things, right? And my son is a basketball player. He loves basketball, he's tall, but not that tall. But the point is that his dream is to become an NBA player, right? But he asked me that many times, can I be an NBA player? I said, well, this might be very hard unless we have a quota, right? You got my point. Second, and I'm an American citizen now, but I grew up in China. Actually, in China, for the college students, there is the quota, at least at the time, and for considering race, and because there are a lot of minorities in China, and also economic conditions, because in some poor area, right? So students had, didn't have access to a pretty good school system, just like here. So I see there are a lot of advantage, right? That's why I support the change, but not this change. This change is too dramatic, right? So what I can tell you one thing, in my class, when I was in the college, right? And then students were from all over the country. And immediately, just after one exam, we realized who came from where. Because the student from some poor area, right? They could get in due to the quota, and just they cannot catch up. They frustrated, and many or not many, at least I knew some students suicide, right? So I just think that this change is dramatic, right? I support change, but not this change. And I echo to the last speaker. Yufang Yang, I think she had a lot of ideas. Can we consider those suggestions, right? Yeah, thank you. That's it.
Thank you. Next speaker is Lei Chi.
Hello, can you hear me?
We can hear you. Thank you.
Good. Good evening. So my name is Lei Chi, and I have 2 children in Boston Public Schools. One is a 6th grader, and the other one is a 3rd grader. So I would like to make an objection to some of the proposed changes from the Boston exam school admission policy. First of all, GPA grades vary between schools, classes, and areas, which makes it unfair to some students. Some schools tend to give higher GPA than other schools. Also, some AWC programs have more advanced curriculums. Although students have the same GPA as other school students, still are more advanced in curriculum achievement. How would you make sure that the GPA for students is fair, since some schools or classes might give their students higher GPA than other schools or classes? Secondly, the idea of considering applicants by zip code is discriminatory measure. Schools exist to serve the students of the entire city, not to give preferences to students from some neighborhoods over others. This is unfair to the students with good curriculum achievements, but do not get the opportunity to go to the exam schools due to the zip code or the lack of being luckily in the lottery. Boston Public Schools should focus on how to improve
20
student
seconds.
curriculum achievement in all schools as a path to equity, while not consider use zip code as an admission criteria. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next speaker is Dan Kin Chiao. I do not see anyone with that name. And Vijay Hedge.
Hello, can you hear me now?
We can hear you, thank you.
Oh, hi. To identify the reasons for low admission rates of African American and Latinx students into Boston's exam schools, you have to look at what exactly the published data shows. There's only one publication which directly deals with this question. This was Harvard Kennedy School's Rappaport Institute, where they looked at Boston exam schools in the year 2018. So this is a paper by Goodman and Rusinski, and it's titled Increasing Diversity in Boston's Exam Schools. The authors demonstrate that Black and Latinx enrollment in BLS can be increased by about 50% if you use the MCAS scores alone and disregard GPAs and ISEE scores. They show that Black and Latinx students with equivalent MCAS scores get assigned lower GPAs than white and Asian students. They also show that Black and Latinx students with the same MCAS scores obtain lower ISEE scores. And this is presumably because the math section of ISEE deals with questions which have not yet been taught in these grades, and well-off students can be taught these concepts through private tutoring. I would urge you to not to try to increase diversity by diluting the admission criteria. Do not use a system of tiers to admit different demographic groups.
20 seconds.
Oh, come on. All right. So I've looked at the studies, and if you dilute the admission criteria and have a tiered admission, the students who make into exam schools will do worse than the students who do not. They have worse academic outcomes. So if you want solutions, it's a series of simple steps. Use an appropriate standardized test. Get rid of GPAs as a metric for admission. It is subjective and very easy to game. Provide funding for additional tutoring and didactic activities for schools that are low performing. Do not dilute academic expectations from economically disadvantaged children. Do not perpetuate the soft racism of low expectations. I will argue for standardized tests. People who disparage standardized tests do not understand the function that these tests serve. Any student who works on improving verbal, reasoning, and mathematical skills will do well in standardized tests. These tests are not designed to unearth extraordinary abilities. Standardized exams are designed to identify two attributes: hard work and cognitive ability. Those very attributes determine success in life. The same rules that apply to sports applies to learning. Abilities are acquired and strengthened through repetitive practice. Hard work and perseverance can make anyone good at test taking. Hard work and perseverance can make anyone knowledgeable and intelligent. Exams are fair. Exams are just. Exams level the playing field. Don't kill the exam. Don't kill the exam score. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Next speaker is Latoya Gale. I don't see Latoya Gale here. So we now have a Mandarin speaker. I will turn off the interpretation icon. Interpreters and the public will all be in the main room, and interpreters, please stop interpreting and mute yourself for this part of the testimony. So next speaker is Emma Yang.
就拎走，咁佢
Emma Yang.
Emma Yang 你在吗？
Just to confirm, Ms. Parvex, who do you want on mute?
All the interpreters are going to be on mute now, and we are only going to have the Mandarin interpreter help Miss Emma Yang.
Okay, thank you.
Emma Yang.
Hello.
Yes, hello.
你好，
哎，你好，我叫艾玛杨，我来自 Dorchester。
My name is Emma Yang. I live in Dorchester.
我有一个6年级的孩子要申请今年的 exam school。
I have a 6th grader that are applying for exam school this year.
我现在就是想知道一下，可不可以分享一下我们今年这个录取的进度到哪里了？
I would like to know if there's a way that you could share with me the process of the admission of this year.
因为今年是 late 了，如果不 late， 我觉得你们的录取工作已经下来了。
Because admission was delayed due to the pandemic. If this is a regular year, we should be starting the admission now.
我想知道一下，就是你们今年就是说，已经录取下来，我们就是不知道，可能家长不就是你们录取下来那个结果和你们那个建议，就是过渡到每个 zip code 和每个人种，就是大概的是怎样个比例，能不能就是说给我们家长介绍一下？
So as a parent, I also would like to know, because I'm confused, that the admission suggestion of this year, the result for admission to go to exam school based on the zip code, and I do not know how the zip code quota works this year.
还有就是我们进候选人这个池子大概有多少个人？然后私立和公立学生的比例，能不能给我们详细的介绍一下？谢谢。没有。
Okay, and I would also like to know how many students that are coming from the applicant pool are from private school and public school. And if you could help me understand that, I would be greatly appreciated.
I just want to make sure, what was the, Ms. Yang, could you please repeat your first question?
杨女士，可不可以你把你第一个问题重复一下？
到候选人这个池子里有多少个人？大约就是6年级学生。第一个问题，总的来说。
Okay, I'd like to know how many applicants to the exam school in total this year from the 6th graders.
Great. So we do not have the information with respect to the total number of applicants. We also do not have the information with respect to the breakdown, public versus private. And I also want to just state that there is no zip code quota.
就是我们现在不知道这个您刚才讲的这个问题哈，就是说有多少的是公立的，多少的私立的这个候选人的池子，还有就是我们现在今年呢还没有决定是使用这个用邮编的入学的方式哈。
Thank you.
谢谢。
Thank you very much. I will now activate the interpretation icon and all the interpreters will be sent to your channel so you can start interpreting again. Ms. Sullivan, Mr. Contompassis, that concludes our speakers for public comment.
Thank you, Ms. Parvex. Thank you to all members of our community who have been with us this evening, and those who have shared with us through public comment. Among the task force members, are there any questions at this time? Is there anything that you'd like to discuss? Yes, Ms. Nagasawa.
I suppose I have two things. So first, to Mr. Contompasis's question earlier about the impact on students' emotions and stress that the exam school process has. While I was doing work this previous summer, I did interview a professor at Loyola University, I believe, who had done research with students in Chicago about the impact, the emotional impact that the selective schools had. So if it's appropriate and of interest to this task force, then I could try to put us in touch with her.
Thank you. Yes.
Great, okay. And then secondly, something I've noticed is that a lot of our participants in public comments are parents, which is wonderful. And I love hearing from parents, but I do also recognize that this is an issue that a lot of students feel strongly about. And we have unfortunately not heard from many students. And I wonder if it would be permissible and appropriate for me to try to organize, I suppose, something like an unofficial listening session where I within my school, at least at first, organize an event where I will be able to hear more feedback from students about the process in the coming years.
Well, I would say, Mr. Contompassis, please let me know what your thinking is on this, but I would say, why make it unofficial? Why don't we make it official? And we can have a listening session with students.
The only thing I would add is it should be citywide.
Agreed.
And so we can set aside either a weekday session.
Yep.
Specifically for students, or if Zoe wants to take on the responsibility, maybe we could communicate using the district's communication department to do something on, let's say, a Saturday morning. Either one, I think, is a great idea. And thank you, Zoe, for bringing it up.
So we can, Zoe, let's connect and figure out your meeting. So you can let us know what works best, what you think would work best for students. We want to make sure that we're accommodating schedules, right? And we'll take it from there. It's good. Ms. Lum.
I'm curious, just piggybacking on that suggestion, which is a great suggestion. How do you, if we're using the district's communication system that will get to the BPS students, how do we get to non-BPS students?
Great question. We will need to work with the comms team to get the word out. And, you know, this is an open meeting. So anyone is welcome to join. So we will, Mr. Contreras and I will work with Ms. Nagasawa and Ms. Roberts to get this planned, get this scheduled. It's good. Thank you. Any other thoughts, comments, questions, reactions?
I just want to make sure that some of the literature that has been forthcoming, that everybody is getting it, thanks to Ms. Tung and others. But, and just in response to Zoe, I think that person you're mentioning at Loyola has reached out to us. Forgive me, I have her name someplace else that I don't have access to right now. But in any case, she sent an email to the task force indicating that she knew what we were doing and that if she could be of any help, you know, she would be happy to do so. I have not yet responded because I just received it a day or so ago. But I do want to continue to stress publicly that for those who may feel uncomfortable presenting to the task force, that we take and read lots of comments that are in writing. And I would like to reinforce the fact that that's another avenue to use, and would encourage the task force members to, as best their time permits, to read some of the articles that have been forthcoming to the task force. And with that, are there any? Go ahead. I'm sorry, Ms. Sullivan. Go ahead.
So I also want to, you know, typically in public comment, we don't get direct questions, but I definitely, you know, when time permits, want to make sure that we are responding to questions that come. And so I actually think this is appropriate, just as a reminder from our meeting last week. My weeks are blending together. That the temporary policy for exam school admissions does not have a quota with respect to zip codes. There's no cap. There's no cap on the number of children who are offered seats based on their zip code. I understand how people may think that that is the case, but I want to remind us that there are kind of two assignment mechanisms used in the temporary policy. The first is a straight GPA rank. And there's no zip code factor, no neighborhood factor. All 20% of those seats could be allocated or offered to students who live in one neighborhood. All of them could be. And the other mechanism does have a neighborhood factor to it. But there's no cap on the number of seats allocated in total. And so I just want to make sure that folks understand that. I think sometimes we get lost in one type of mechanism for seat allocation, and we forget about the other. So I just wanted to respond to that. And hopefully that's helpful for some folks to understand. Okay, Mr. Contopasis.
Thank you, Ms. Sullivan. Anything further? If not, I will entertain a motion to adjourn the meeting. May I have a motion, please?
So moved.
I move.
Thank you. A second?
I second.
Thank you.
So I believe that was Ms. Lum who made the
And-
motion and Ms. Grassa who seconded.
And Ms. Grassa, thank you. Any discussion or objection to the motion? Hearing none, Ms. Parvex, please call the roll.
Thank you very much. Ms. Aguirre,
Yes.
Dr. Freeman Wisdom,
Yeah.
Ms. Grassa,
Present.
Ms. Lam,
Yes.
Ms. Nagasawa,
Yes.
Ms. Garrett,
Yes.
Ms. Tang,
Yes.
Ms. Wade,
Yes.
Ms. Sullivan,
Yes.
Mr. Contopasis.
Yes,
It's unanimous.
thank you. The meeting is officially adjourned.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.